Welcome everyone to our session on adaptation to coastal erosion and flooding in the case of Australia. My name is Fahim Tonmoy. I work in a consulting company called BMT and also an adjunct research fellow at Griffith University. Uh, I, I was born and worked in Bangladesh for 25 years, so it's been really exciting for me to be part of this Gobeshona conference. Uh, Climate change challenge in Bangladesh is in a different scale than in Australia. However, there are the opportunities of adaptation. There are similarities in opportunities of adaptations. Most of the examples that will be presented today in our session are from Queensland in northeast of Queensland, northeast of Australia. There are some similarities with Bangladesh, both in terms of climate, in terms of both parts are in the tropical and subtropical climate zone, with pleasant in winter, hot and humid in summer. The Tropic of Cancer runs through the middle of Bangladesh, and Tropic of Capricorn runs through the middle of Queensland. So we have put together a panel of experts today from both from academia as well as from industry in Australia. They work in climate adaptation space, specifically focusing on coastal adaptations. We include case studies from the length of Queensland coastline, from Cairns in the north to the Gold Coast in the south. So we hope the presentation will trigger some interesting discussion points about climate adaptation in Australia as well as in Bangladesh. We have kept plenty of time for discussion at the end. So keep your questions for the discussion session at the end. And please also use the chat function to add your questions over there. We'll be monitoring that throughout the session. So at the beginning, I would like to introduce Professor Jean Palutikof to run this session. Jane is the director at National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCCARF, under Griffith University in Australia. And prior to that, Jane was based at the UK Met Office, during which time she managed the production of IPCC's fourth assessment report. So I would like to welcome Jane, and over to you for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Fahim. Just wait for you to unshare your screen. Thanks. So can you see my screen?
No, it hasn't popped up yet, Jean.
Yeah, I've lost sight of my desktop. Yeah, the problem is I can't actually get my mouse onto the screen with that would get to the right location.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Yeah,
so will you'll change the slide when I ask you to, Fahim? Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So I am Jean Palutikof, as Fahim introduced me, and I'm going to introduce this session and give you just a little bit of the context of coastal adaptation in Australia. Next slide, please, Fahim. So the first issue then is what is the problem? And the problem is that Australia has many soft coasts and they are prone to erosion and inundation, and that's already occurring at the present day. And the problem for us is that the risks will increase in future due to sea level rise. So on the right, you can see the historical record of global sea level rise. And the rate throughout the 20th century was around 1.4 millimeters per year, but that has accelerated in the recent years, in the 21st century, and now it's up to about 3.6 millimeters per year. And these are statistics that are coming, at least in the recent period, from satellite observations. So we have considerable confidence in their accuracy. If you look at the map on the left, you can see that sea level rise isn't equal across the globe. There are areas where the rate of increase is a little bit lower, and areas of increase where that are a little bit higher than the global average. But broadly speaking, it's about the same amount everywhere. 3.6 millimeters per year is a figure that you could apply throughout. But if you wanted to look at regional variation, then you can see that in Australia, actually, the rate is a little bit higher. Next slide, please, Fahim. So we've got this problem in the present day, and sea level rise isn't going to go away because it's caused by global warming. So looking out into the future, we expect only that the problem will get worse. So global sea level are projected to rise by about 0.43 of a meter, 43 centimeters by 2100, compared to the period 1986 to 2005. But that's provided that our emissions are low, that we move to a much greener way of carrying on than is the case at the present time. For a high emissions scenario, then by 2100, we expect that sea levels will be about 84 centimeters higher than they were at the end of the 20th century. And these figures are about the most up-to-date I could find. They're coming from the IPCC special report on oceans and cryosphere. There's a map on the left, on the right, sorry, that shows you what sea levels look like around Australia for a range of different scenarios. The one at the bottom right is for a high emissions scenario, and the one on the top left is for the low emissions scenario, which delivers 43 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100. But broadly speaking, you can assume that Australia will have very, very similar rates of sea level rise to the global ones that are shown there. Next slide, please, Fahim. So as I said, there are already risks from erosion and flooding today along soft coastlines in Australia. And this erosion and flooding takes place primarily during cyclones and windstorms, but of course the damage persists beyond the events. So our coastlines along beaches and away from cliffs, they're gradually being damaged by the effects of waves during cyclones and windstorms. And sea level rise increases these risks in the future. And of course, for us, these are particularly severe where there are high concentrations of people and of infrastructure. And the map on the right shows you a scenario of Brisbane in 2100 under a high CO2 emissions scenario, and the areas in blue are the areas that we expect to be flooded in 2100 if we really take no action to address the risks. And you can see, well, the red line shows you the area of the city of Brisbane, and you can see the CBD, the Central Business District, lies pretty much along the River Brisbane that you can see there, going from the bottom left to the top right. And you can see that flooding is clearly going to be a risk for the built-up area in Brisbane in the future if nothing is done. Next slide, please, Fahim. So these are the physical risks from sea level rise, but of course they're imposed on social and economic factors that can make Australia more or less vulnerable. And the fact is that something like 80% of Australians live along the coastal zone, so we are quite vulnerable. And it's been estimated that about 6% of Australian addresses are within 3 kilometres of the shoreline and in areas which are less than 5 metres above mean sea level. So that's about 700,000 houses which are particularly vulnerable within 3 kilometres of the shoreline and at less than 5 metres above sea level. Does make you vulnerable in the present day to windstorm and cyclones, and particularly vulnerable looking out into the future. So you can see the two graphs on the right. The top one shows you the present day situation. So it shows you the number of households in each state where QLD is Queensland, we're particularly interested in here, that are, the orange bar is within 55 millimetres of soft shorelines, and the blue bar is within 110 millimetres of soft shorelines. And you can see the numbers. So for Queensland, it's slightly under 6,000 residences for within 55 metres and going up to about 15,000 for 110 metres. But the interesting thing then is if you look out into the future, so this is the bottom right graph is for 2100. These are from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. And the orange bars show you so they're looking at changes in population. So they assume a sea level rise of about 1.1 metre by 2100. And then you have 4 population scenarios where orange is present, well, 2008 population, and the red, blue and yellow bars are scenarios of population looking out into the future. And what you can see is that really it's an order of magnitude change in the number of residences that are vulnerable to flooding in 2100 for a sea level rise of 1.1 metre. And if you remember in the third slide, I showed you the likely range for sea level rise for a high emission scenario in 2100. The upper limit was indeed 1.1 metre. So this is a highly likely scenario. It's not something which is beyond the bounds of our imagination. And it's probably the case, quite a few of these figures were arrived at 10 or more years ago. Really, we should be looking at a more severe scenario than we are doing at the present time. Next slide, please, Fahim. So what's being done about coastal risk in Australia? Well, basically, there are 3 tiers of government in Australia. At the federal level, it's a highly politicised issue, climate change in general, and there isn't a great deal of leadership at the present time. If you could just press again, please, Fahim, there's a bit of an animation here. Then the federal government has put some investment into looking at adaptation to climate change. And Sarah will tell you in a moment about a tool that they funded to help decision makers adapt to future climate change and sea level rise. At the state level, there's quite a considerable amount of support for local governments. So there is, for example, strategies. This is the Queensland strategy for future climate change. And there are tools. If you press twice for him, you'll see that there are tools that are to help local governments, where most of the action is, to take action to address the risks from sea level rise and climate change. Next slide. And you can see across Australia, here are just some examples of the plans that have been drawn up by coastal councils across Australia. Next slide, please. But the problem is that the planning often fails to lead to action. And we have to consider why this is. What are the barriers to action? And what can we do to overcome these barriers? Well, we know, as I've said, that you need leadership, you need planning, you need knowledge, you need tools, you need finance to underpin successful adaptation. But even once these are overcome, there may still be additional, less obvious barriers. And we surveyed practitioners in government and the private sector to understand their thinking around barriers to adaptation. Next slide, please. And this graph just shows you the survey responses that we received from local and state government to one question that we asked, which is what are the major challenges to adaptation? And what they told us is that there are two clear and related winners, that one of the barriers lies around the difficulties in engaging with the community, and another lies, and it is related, in the conflict between decision makers and coastal residences. And over half of local and state government respondents in this survey selected the need for effective community engagement as a prerequisite for successful adaptation. And local governments also identified the issue around legal liability. That doesn't show in this graph because this combines local and state government respondents. We can see very clearly that engaging with the community in conflicts between decision makers and residents are very important. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you an example, and this is taken from Facebook, of some of the challenges to engagement with the community and the need for local governments to achieve buy-in that arise in Australia. So this is a post on Facebook by ABC, which is the major government funded but independent broadcasting company in Australia. And it's a post about remarks by the chief executive of a council that has suffered a considerable amount of coastal erosion and damage to buildings due to the risks that have been experienced by wave damage and storm surge. What the chief executive has said is that there really needs to be leadership from the federal government in order to enable local governments to take action and properly address the risks that are emerging. Next slide. I'm just going to show you now some of the responses that came in from this this post from the ABC and these remarks by this chief executive. So going from the top, the first one says, well, you know, basically it's unlikely that the federal government is going to do anything. The risks are very high. And household insurance isn't going to cover the risk, so buyer beware. And then the next three, they all pretty much say, well, you know, you chose to buy your house in the coastal zone. It's your problem. You need to fix it. This is not something that the wider community should be financing. You have to go away and sort it out for yourselves. So you can see there's considerable pushback from the community when discussions are underway about the need to protect the coastline, and people who live away from the coast and don't occupy these very expensive coastal residences are very unwilling to be involved in any action and any financing of adaptation. So it's a continuing problem here in Australia. Next slide, please. So now I just want to introduce the rest of the session, and I thought I would do this by just saying, well, why are we focusing on Queensland? And I think really the main reason is that in Queensland there's as much or maybe more action around adaptation along the coast than you will find elsewhere in Australia. So Fahim, if you could just press once. So there is the climate adaptation strategy, which underpins adaptation action in Queensland. There are sector adaptation plans, press again please, which have been funded by the government and cover off on the major sectors of economic and social activity. There have been efforts by the state government to produce information and knowledge. If you press again, there is a website that provides climate and sea level rise scenarios, and there is even financing. So the state government has put up money for projects to address the challenges that have been identified by the sector adaptation plans. And there is the initiative of QCoast 2100. If you press again, please, Fahim, which assists councils to advance coastal hazard adaptation planning, and is underwritten by 13.3 million Australian dollars of state funding and at the present time is House 48 projects, which are basically climate sea level rise assessment and risk planning by local councils. And you will hear about them in the presentations that take place here this afternoon. Last slide, please, Fahim. So these are the presentations today. Sarah will talk about a tool which has been funded by the federal government to support decision making for adaptation in Australia, Coast Adapt. David, Robyn and Fahim, David, Robyn and Rodger will talk about case studies for Australia and Queensland, running from north to south, from Cairns, from Mackay and the Gold Coast. And Fahim will talk a little bit more generally, I think, about risk to assets and infrastructure. So that's the sequence of presentations this afternoon. And now I'd just like to introduce Sarah. Sarah Boulter is a senior research fellow in the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. She's done extensive work in climate change adaptation, and she's going to talk about Coast Adapt, which is a decision support platform for decision makers in the coastal zone. Over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Jean. So I would like to, first of all, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm sitting today, which is the Ngunnawal people. And it's something we do in Australia, acknowledging our First Nations people. But I think it's useful in this context because in terms of thinking about locally led adaptation, which the conference is about, our First Nations people are very much, have shown that they have been very adaptable to changing climate over a very long period of time. And much of the way that was done was through information and stories. And Coast Adapt is a tool that was funded by the Australian government. It was developed over a period of about 3 years, led by the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, NCCARF, hosted by Griffith Uni. And all the participants on the panel here today were very much involved or in some way involved in developing the tool. And the purpose of the tool, what the federal government was looking for was something that could help local councils in particular address the impacts of climate change and in particular sea level rise. In the end became an online platform and it was developed through thinking a lot about what it is that people needed in terms of the information and the support and the sharing of stories that would help them to undertake what is a very difficult challenge. So this is so I'm going to really spend just this time really giving you a quick tour of the tool. This is what the homepage looks like, and I'll put a link at the end of the talk. You can see it's a very visually attractive website, or we think it is, and certainly that was our intention. We wanted to be able to make it an appealing and accessible site, and a lot of work was done to develop that in that format. But there was also a lot of work in terms of what went into it and how we thought people might use it. In terms of developing the tool, we undertook what could be described as a demand-driven consultation and testing process. We undertook workshops around Australia. Australia is a fairly big country. That's a lot of area to cover off on, and we were able to access about 700 people in terms of thinking about what it is that they wanted in the tool. We also developed a partnership, and Robyn, who will speak shortly, was a member of that initially as the tool development partnership. So that was thinking about or helping us, I guess, and checking and testing as we developed the tool if we were getting it right, if it was likely to meet the needs of our target audience. So that included representatives from a number of local councils around Australia. We also had a small business industry representative on the development partnership as well. We did end up evolving that into an implementation partnership so that when the tool was completed and launched online, that group of people were also able to help us in terms of being champions for the tool and helping roll it out and get the word out there and demonstrate to people how it could be used. The tool includes a number of elements that I just wanted to touch on. I think importantly at the centre of the tool is a decision-making framework. This is what you see here. We called it CCADS, which is the, oh, I'm on the spot, I can't remember what it stands for, but you can see that it's very similar to a number of adaptation decision support frameworks in the steps that it provides. And we use this as the core of the tool to really help users to step through a process at the end of which we would hope that they would have developed an adaptation plan and perhaps even gotten to take some actions and been able to test and monitor and evaluate how those actions were working for them. The tool also included some data visualization tools. One in particular, the main one was really about giving people information and access to sea level rise projections. We presented the information in two clear different ways. One was to show it as a graph, as you can see the graph here on the left-hand side of the screen, which shows the observations information, that sort of green wiggly line, but then projection information going forward. And we allowed people the opportunity to switch in and out different RCP scenarios so that they could have a think about what the different consequences of different policy and future progress might mean. We also used bathtub modelling to demonstrate this as inundation mapping, and this information was all delivered so that it was presented for each individual council area. There's about 500 of them around the coast of Australia, and for most locations we were able to provide this information. There were some areas where there isn't digital elevation modelling available and we weren't able to provide the mapping for that. We did, through some testing, add additional information around projections around other climate factors. So you can see here on the bottom left, we've got information about heat waves, which is very topical for us here in Australia today. Where I am, we're about to have an extreme heat event, but looking at some of that information as well as the sea level rise information. We also provided a very large amount of information, and we presented that in a number of different ways. Centrally were the web pages, and they could be orientated to from the home page, and we presented the information on the web pages at different levels. So there was a high level summary at a glance, and then there was more detailed information. So people were able to, we called it skim, wade or dive into information. So the idea was to scaffold information in a way that allowed people to access it at the level that they were interested or able to deal with at the time, but also an opportunity to dig deeper as and when they needed to. We also provided 10 information manuals, which were somewhat more technical information on particular topics. So you can see the example here is engineering solutions, but we also looked at things like planning, legal issues, ecosystems, and also things like community engagement and participation. We also provided some more high-level summaries of information. So on the bottom left there, we have what we called our infographics. We produced a number of these to really look at a technical concept or idea and explain it in a fairly simple and graphical way. These have been really popular and you know, stand the steed in terms of giving information to users. We also provided a number of case studies, and there's a snapshot there, and we did those in a couple of formats, and I'll look at those in a little bit more detail here. So one of the other things that our end users said that they were interested in was learning from each other. That peer-to-peer understanding and sharing was incredibly important in terms of looking at what works and what doesn't work and sharing those experiences. So we did that in a number of ways. We've developed quite a large collection of case studies. I believe last count there was about 80 of them. Some of them are very small sort of snapshots. Some of them are slightly more detailed case studies and run to several pages. We also, when the website was first set up, we also set up sort of a community of practice, an opportunity for users to exchange information online through a portal. We found that the uptake was not very fast in that respect, and unfortunately when funding dried up, we had to close that. But you know, it's interesting, we still hear comments from people looking for that opportunity to share that information, to talk to each other in a sort of non-formal setting. And you know, so I think that's an interesting point in terms of what we tried to do with Coast Adapt. I think in reflection, there were a whole bunch of opportunities that we've identified through developing Coast Adapt. I guess Coast Adapt, it still remains, I think I can safely say this, the only online portal in Australia for adaptation. And, you know, there's really an opportunity there to use that model, duplicate or build upon the experience that we have with Coast Adapt to expand the information and focus of providing that support for adaptation in different sectors. And also I think there's an opportunity to evolve and develop something like Coast Adapt, or that information portal as progress and adaptation occurs. You know, when we were developing Coast Adapt, and I should say Coast Adapt was developed in the period between about 2014 and 2017, at that time, there was a lot of people looking at planning, and I think, you know, in the community of practice has moved a little bit from that now. There's certainly still an awful lot of planning happening, but people are really thinking a lot more about taking action and things like monitoring and evaluation. I think that evolution and progress is something that something like Coast Adapt could build upon. There was obviously a lot of challenges involved in developing something like this. Sustainable funding, which I've hinted at a little bit. The funding for Coast Adapt was provided for 3 years, and we have not been able to secure funding, major funding, to keep updating and building on that since. And I guess one of the other challenges is keeping the information up to date with new data sets and information. And obviously the older the site becomes, the more information there is that requires updating that is not being updated at the moment. So that just gives you a very quick snapshot of Coast Adapt. There's the web address. I'd really encourage people to take a look. There are some fantastic resources there in terms of general information about climate change and adaptation. We had contributions from a very large number of experts and on-ground practitioners. So I think it's a real wealth of information that I think in any context people will find useful. You can also have a look at the NCCARF website, which has some more general information around adaptation that's likely to be useful for people thinking about local adaptation. And so that's all I wanted to talk about. So I'll hand back the screen and the microphone to Jean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for that introduction to Coast Adapt. It was very interesting and good to hear it from to be reminded of just how useful it has been. Our next speaker is David Rissik. Dave was the Deputy Director in the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility and was very important in the conceptualization and realization of Coast Adapt. He's since moved on to be a senior principal at BMT Environment Australia, which is a large consulting company where he's working extensively in coastal adaptation in Australia, but more widely, I think, in the Pacific Basin, and he has very large experience in working with local government around their adaptation planning. And he's going to deliver one of our case studies about coastal adaptation. I think, yes, Dave is looking at Cairns. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Jean. I'm assuming everyone can see my slides and can hear me.
Yes, yes,
great.
Yes.
That's excellent. So it's a great opportunity to talk to you all about the work we've been doing up in Cairns, which is in far north Queensland. Bear in mind that I've got a 10-minute presentation. I'm talking about work that's taken place over 2 years. And so there's a lot of detail I won't be able to show you, but hopefully you'll be able to get the gist of the substantial body of work that's being done in this planning. And as Jean said in her introduction, the funding for this work has come from the Queensland government, which has been showing a lot of leadership in driving the way forward for many of our local governments and many of our communities in Queensland to address climate change. The biggest challenge will come when we actually start to implement these plans, as you'll see as I work through the presentation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Cairns, it's, as I said, far north Queensland. You can see up on the map. It's got about 81 kilometres of coastline, a fairly small population by in terms of the centres, but in terms of North Queensland, it's the biggest town at that side of the world with about 166,000 people. It's a very important tourism place because it gets easy access to the Great Barrier Reef, which is another aspect of that climate change is putting a big question around, but we won't talk about that this afternoon. But Cairns is a real tourism hub and suffering at the moment because of COVID and the lack of international visitors. It has 11 broad coastal communities and beach areas, and it's got quite a lot of local businesses. About 20% of all the properties in Cairns are affected by coastal hazard. So we were following a process that was mandated by the Queensland government in terms of the guidelines and the state planning policy. It's a risk-based standard based on the international risk standard 31,000. Sarah talked about CCADs in Coast Adapt, which is also based on the same process and has proved to be a very useful tool with very useful information that has helped us and a lot of my colleagues who work in this space to work through a lot of the processes that we deal with. Risk-based frameworks are really useful because they help us to address and deal with the uncertainty that we face in dealing with climate change. There's uncertainty about virtually every aspect of it. And we need to have processes that can allow us to work through those and learn. And Sarah mentioned monitoring. That proves to be a really important process in this space. The other thing that's great about a risk-based framework is it really helps you to focus on where the highest levels of risk are. And so where you really need to focus your resources, which are difficult to come by. At the moment in a COVID-affected world, to think about how you can get money to address things that might not be happening for a few years, and certainly sometimes challenges the community in that space, is a very big challenging issue. So there's a number of different assets that we have and we in the area that we are concerned about in this process. Is not just about the built environment. It is about the built environment, but it's also about community and cultural values. It's about the natural environment and ecological values. It's obviously about planning and thinking about the existing, but also the future infrastructure that we have. The coasts and the coastal places that we're working with are really important places for connection of the community and where people get together. And of course, there's all these important natural features, wildlife and habitats, and all of these are things that people worry about. So we've talked to a lot of people in this process. Jean mentioned in a slide earlier about the importance of engagement when it comes to adaptation, and I'd say from my experience, engagement is absolutely key, and I don't think you can ever do enough. And we've tried really hard to engage the very, very broad section of the community. You can see here, I'm not going to go into that detail. I'd say we probably haven't done as much as we would like to, but it's expensive, it's time consuming, and it often people like to get things moving, and engagement is complicated and messy. And it's challenging, and it's very difficult to let go and to drive in one single path when you're hearing the views of very, very many people. So the key findings that came from our engagement, and this is important to just think about when I talk about the rest of the talk, is that the most important things that people were concerned about in Cairns were natural green spaces. They loved the sandy beaches, and those were the really most highly valued characteristics of the coast. People wanted better protected foreshores, and they wanted more vegetation along the coastline, and they wanted their beaches to be maintained or kept in their natural state. Access to the beach is also very important. So we often think about the people who live along the beach and they have easy access, and they often want their foreshore protected or their properties protected, but that has complications for beaches below them. But everyone in the region, in the area, likes access to the beach and likes to get to the water, and so that's a really important criterion to be thinking about as we work through our plan. So the first step was to do updates, a lot of mapping, a lot of the technical work to underpin the planning, and that we were dealing with 3 different hazards in this process. We were looking at coastal erosion, we were looking at storm tide inundation, and we were also looking at land vulnerable to sea level rise. And so we needed to update the mapping associated with all of those and the modelling. And the timeframes we used were for 2020, 2040, 2060, 2080, and 2100. So we basically did quite a lot of mapping to look at all those different hazards in those particular time periods. Now this is I'm going to focus now on the city centre of Cairns. So this is a photo, oblique aerial photo of the city centre. You can see that it's quite built up. You can also see that it's very low. There's an airport up at the top right-hand side of the slide, which is a very low-lying area of Cairns. And there's a lot of tourist accommodation, hotel accommodation, and businesses, as well as probably the most stupidly placed hospital in Australia, which is right on the foreshore. And if they were to try and move that, it costs over $2.5 billion. And so they continue to invest in building more, in upgrading the hospital and building ancillary services around it. And that's another challenge that we've been working closely with the hospital to try and address up in Cairns as well. So this is a little bit of the modelling, the sea level rise modelling. So this is 2020, and you can see if you look at the centre of the map, there's blue already, and that's at the very big tides of the year. You get areas of Cairns streets already getting covered in salt water, and they're able to deal with that. They put up signs saying don't drive here. There's salt water on the road, and people basically accept that and move around it because they know that it's only going to happen for a couple of days at best, and it goes away and comes back. And they make sure that if they're going to work, they're parking a different road for a change. When we look at 2060, you can start to see that the story is somewhat different now, that quite large areas of Cairns will get inundated at those very high tides, which means that there are going to be quite a number of areas of Cairns that will be inundated at other tidal cycles as well, and it'll be much more regular. And it's this sort of challenge. And the right-hand side of the graph, just left of the yellowy greeny areas, which are natural areas, is quite an area where there's lots of work and the ports and lots of access required. And you can see that that will be challenged. If you look at the north side, you can see the airport is also going to be very challenged at this stage. So when we look at 2100, the fact that Cairns was built in a swamp really becomes clear. And basically there are no evacuation routes that are able to leave from the beachfront to get out of town. And virtually every area, apart from a little island in the middle, is compromised. So a massive challenge for council to address. So we've been dealing with that, and the first thing we did was to run a first pass risk assessment where we looked at the planning cadastre and looked at the risk associated with over 11,000 assets, and we were able to look at likelihood and consequences of these getting inundated by the different or affected by erosion, by those different hazards. And we then looked at a number of different priority assets, and you can see there that there are significant community assets that are affected. And I'm not counting people's own houses here, but here we had emergency facilities, vulnerable people's facilities, schools, the airport, community buildings, libraries, etc. All affected. So just a brief graph of showing how this changes over time. We've got the 3 hazards: erosion prone area on the left, sea level rise in the middle, and storm tide interval, the 1% of that on the right hand side. And when we look at the different colors, we've got blue meaning no risk, green meaning a low risk, and medium is yellow, high is orange, and severe risk is red. And you can see that sea level rise is going to increase the number of very severe risks over time, with storm tide impacts being no risk areas really declining over time, and the medium risks increasing. The reason those aren't severe risks is that storm tide interval only happens intermittently, whereas sea level rise will be virtually consistent and continuous. There are fewer houses that are affected and priority assets that were affected by the erosion-prone areas. So, but it's still a very big focus of our challenge. So we identified a number of different adaptation options, and again, we've got an adaptation options report of about 300 pages. But putting it into one slide is quite difficult. But really, what we tried to do in the short term was do things that would have immediate benefits to the community and were no-brainer. They were the things that would help build the resilience of Cairns, but at the same time improve it in the present day. So we've really focused on beach, dune and foreshore management to increase their resistance to erosion. We've looked at wetland and riparian vegetation enhancement, looking at native vegetation management to improve resilience to sea level rise. So that's really looking at some of the lower lying parklands and wetlands within Cairns. We trying to put in place monitoring that will take place regularly to ensure that we are able to take next steps if the erosion is actually starting to impact on the beaches. We're really focusing on emergency management and ensuring that evacuation routes are identified, that we can map out new ones that will work in the short to medium term. And really, one of the most important things is to avoid placing new or replacing any priority assets in high-risk areas. And so we're looking at all the planning controls in the city and working with planners to try and stop any city developments going forward. And planning responses and controls are really important as well. In the medium term, we'll continue to do the dune restoration and augmentation, raising road levels where we can without just transferring the problem, looking at raising services and access points so that if there is temporary flooding, it doesn't stop things happening. There's a lot of contaminated sites in Cairns because in the old days, they just came in and filled up the wetland with whatever they could. And so we're looking at how we can manage some of those areas where there's not toxic material and try and do that better. And one of the things we're starting to talk about with a lot of people involved in urban design is what we trying to do is how can the city be redesigned to cope and thrive with regular seawater ingress? So there's a term called salty urbanism, which I love, and it's sort of how do you actually allow a city that's low-lying to have salt water moving in and out of it, but without impacting the regular lifestyle of the people who live there. So it's a little bit like what we call in the freshwater, we use water-sensitive urban design, and we can manage cities that way. This is doing that with salt water, and I think it's a definite way to go in very low-lying places. Because people have this love of getting into the water, we're also looking at how we can address boat ramps into the future and the associated facilities so people can continue access. In the long term, there's got to be planned transition. So we'll be looking at where different services might need to be moved, where in some places where council won't be able to afford to protect, and people and businesses will have to relocate over time. And we're trying to look at how we can do that in an economically and socially justified way, this is where the council laws come in. It's quite challenging. Engineering solutions become more important longer term in the future. And then the opportunities for floating structures and infrastructure is also very important. And where places move, if we move businesses, if we move buildings, we can convert those to open space uses and revegetate them and use them to increase buffers. So we do have, thanks, Jean, perfect timing. So we've used the adaptation pathways approach, which a lot of people talk about, which is incredibly difficult to implement when you have a whole lot of different actions. And we've taken a very simplified version of approach to looking at that, in really looking at sequencing of solutions. Certain solutions need to be done in tandem. It can be done in the short term. And what we've tried to do is map out for council, not a time-bound pathway, but a pathway that's based around sea level rise, so that if we reach those levels, those perhaps would be the triggers that we need to use to implement some of these solutions. And so for the various, we've broken the city of those 81 kilometers into about 12 different sub areas. And for each of those, we've developed these pathways that can then guide the city's investment into the future. And I think the main thing I'd end with the message from this is really, we've got time to do things better and to learn, but we do have to start to act now. So the shorter term options that we put into place, really enhancing our natural assets, using the natural environment as much as we possibly can, and hoping to goodness that people get climate change under control and we won't need to take some of those really expensive options that are going to be critical in the future. Thanks, Jean.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks. That was really interesting and a good introduction to the case studies and the problems that are being faced along the coast of Queensland. So the next speaker is Robyn Birkett. Robyn is a principal engineer for Waterways with the Mackay Regional Council, and she's going to talk about coastal climate adaptation, a local authority perspective. Robyn.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to pay, oops, I'll just make sure I've got this up. Can everyone see my screen? Excellent. I'd like to start off by paying my respects to the traditional owners on the land from where I'm presenting today, the Yuwi-Burra and the Yuwi-Bira tribes, and pay my respect to those present, past and emerging. So where we are, I'm probably halfway between Cairns and Brisbane, and we're a wet tropics bioregion and have 320 kilometres of coastline with around 24 coastal communities. We look after a range of services, roads, waste, community services, so it is very wide-ranging. I'm in the strategic planning area, focusing on more the natural hazards, whereas I do work closely with planners, engineers, as well as emergency management. And David gave a good overview of where local government sits with such a wide-ranging asset base. Mackay gets affected by cyclones. Normally there's one cyclone every 2 years. We had a significant cyclone in 1918, which has shaped our landscape and our planning response. So we've had development levels since around the 1980s that have been at that tidal inundation from that 1918 storm. So in Mackay, past events have shaped our response, and I'll go through a couple of case studies later. In Mackay too, we also have 40% of our properties affected by coastal and inland flooding hazards. So you can see this is a picture of the Mackay CBD in here, and you can see we've got the Coral Sea to the east and the Pioneer River. So as David was talking about, I don't have all the slides that show all the different hazards for Mackay, but the Pioneer River, as well as the coastal hazards, pose a significant risk. And we've got around 4 kilometres of urban seawalls and around 11 kilometres of riverine seawalls that have been constructed since the 1950s to protect the Mackay CBD and some of our key urban areas. We've been looking at the impacts of climate change and we've adopted those in our planning scheme, which controls new development. So we've had those controls in our planning scheme since 2017, as well as previous studies going back to 2010. So for all our coastal hazard studies and flood studies, we include 0.8 metre sea level rise, which is the high emission scenario, and a 20% increase in rainfall intensity. So we're quite established in how we are planning for the future and making sure we continue in our adaptation to minimise the risks to our community going forward. We have an overarching environmental sustainability strategy, which being a resilient region is one of those ones. So it is very important to us, as well as being a low carbon region, resource efficient, sustainable, smart, and regional and community partnerships. So we are looking at it holistically with the vision to be sustainable, prosperous and livable. We were lucky to also receive funding for coastal adaptation through the QCoast 2100 program. And one of the big projects that we undertook is doing property level surveys of floor levels, as well as revising our riverine and coastal flood studies. So we now have a tool at the property level, so where you can search and get what the existing risks are, as well as what the future risks are at 2100. So that's a really good tool. And we've also got floor levels and ground levels on the property, so you can see whether it's above floor flooding or not. And that has gone into our stage of our coastal hazard adaptation study, where we're still in this identify and assess, but we have had parts of our coastal communities that have gone into actually implementing measures, such as at McEwen's Beach, which I'll talk about soon. Mackay Regional Council was lucky to be involved with Coast Adapt. As Sarah mentioned before, we were a tool development and tool implementation partner. So the CCADS process, which I've got in there, is in line with what we're doing with the QCoast 100 work, which is assessing our risks, identifying options, evaluation, taking action, monitoring, and going through the whole system. And what we've found is that all our coastal communities are at different stages. Some are really keen to adapt, and some are really, no, where we just want to stay as we are. We like the beach as it is. And yeah, so we've got to be mindful and do locally led adaptation, considering those values that those coastal communities have. Just going to go through McEwen's Beach, which is around 12 kilometres south of Mackay. So it's an area where the residents have been subject to coastal erosion for many years. So over the last 50 years, there's been around 95 metres change in the coastline. So the residents who were living on the foreshore identified that they wanted something done, and over 15 to 20 years that we've been talking to those residents, and they finally came together to look at a locally led adaptation process. So they self-funded a seawall. So it's protecting 8 properties, as well as part of a council reserve and access to a beach. You can see here, there's the northern parts. You can see there's a considerable loss of sand in that northern community, and the beach wall just goes in from here. So it is a small population of around 140, but they are very passionate about protecting their property. So council has been working with them for the last 5 years, and yeah, there's further details in a paper if you Google McEwen's Beach. But yeah, this is what it looks like here. So it used to look like an erosion scarp, and this is the seawall that has a 50-year life. that was constructed. And you can see there the extent of the seawall. So that's stage 1, but there is a further stage that could be undertaken when the need arises and the community would like to progress with that. And that's just a zoom in of that there. So yeah, it was funded by the residents, and there was a land swap. So the residents now own the seawall and the property in front of it. You can see there's a no build area within the land that was previously a coastal esplanade, and there's been a lot of work done in the planning and legal and easement process to make sure that the responsibility and ownership and maintenance is clear for that seawall. We also have a policy about urban seawalls where we'll only facilitate those if they're protecting the council asset rather than a private property. And you can find further details on that on our website. So we're looking at doing local adaptation planning for each of the communities, but just at a very basic level, we've got planning controls and emergency management in place at each coastal community. We've got emergency action guides, the planning scheme, as well as local beach plans or local coastal plans for each of those 24 communities, which go into the detail about revegetation and public access to those beaches. So that's how we like to address sort of the locally relevant issues about values and community engagement through those local coastal plans. And the long-term ones are dealt with through our planning scheme and development controls. So you can see for McEwen's Beach, it's been going for 20 years, and also the tropical cyclones and their impact on tipping to different new measures is very considerable. So we find that after a cyclone, we're changing the measures. So we need to be looking at those with that in mind in the future as well. I just wanted to talk about another one where we've done on the ground work that resulted from Tropical Cyclone Debbie in 2017. And there was considerable work, about $8 million worth of works at Midge Point and Lambert's Beach. So Midge Point's 70 kilometres north of Mackay, and Lambert's Beach is one of the coastal beaches in our urban area in Mackay. And these projects weren't funded by council, they were funded by the state and federal governments. And one of them down here is a buried seawall to protect the road and the foreshore from future erosion, as well as considerable sand nourishment. And at Lambert's Beach, there was considerable sand nourishment instead of a seawall. So we've got a good understanding of those costs now for sand nourishment, as well as geobag seawalls or buried geobag seawalls. And we'll be looking at the cost of those. But as David mentioned, it is a difficult situation. You can have self-funded seawalls, or then you could have an event and get some money to build back better, I suppose. So it is a very contentious area, and we are progressing, I suppose, steady as we go, and we want to be fully informed and before we invest a significant amount of money in future protection works. But we're doing a lot on, I suppose, the soft measures, such as having good planning controls, good emergency management measures, as well as understanding what the communities value and going forward to make sure that we are planning for the future with a changing climate. But we know that we could be subject to those extreme events this season, so it's really just a luck of the draw. But with climate change, it's amplifying those risks. These are just some of the challenges that we have, and one of the ones is engagement with the existing community. where the impacts might be 20 or so years. So we want to make sure that people understand the risks of where they are at a property level and have ongoing education about responsibilities, and that it's not only council, everyone has a responsibility to play in climate adaptation and in a lot of works that investment now will save in the future. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Robyn. That was great. It's very interesting to hear about what's happening at the grassroots in Mackay and the efforts you're having to make to reconcile all the different pressures that exist in coastal adaptation. So our next speaker is Fahim Tonmoy. If you were here at the beginning of the session, you've already met him. He's currently a senior engineer with BMT Commercial Australia. He's working now for a consulting company, but he was previously working in the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility, and he was actually responsible for the day-to-day management of Coast Adapt and therefore the final delivery of a functioning tool. He's going to talk about infrastructure and asset management and climate change and sea level rise. So over to you, Fahim.
Thanks, Jane. Hi, everyone. So in my talk, I'll try to bring a point of view of infrastructure management and its importance from climate change adaptation point of view. And by doing that, I'll present a specific case study project that I have recently worked on. So as Jean mentioned in her presentation that over 80% of Australia's population lives within 50 kilometers of the coastline. So a lot of infrastructure has been already built and will be built in future close to the coastal areas to support the economic activity of the country. And it is important that the climate adaptations are considered in the design and maintenance of these assets because some of the design life of some of these assets are really long. So think from an asset management point of view, some of the assets like bridge, large dams, or transport infrastructure, they last for 40 to 100 years. So whatever we are putting in terms of design considerations today will be there with us in future. So climate adaptation is really critical for the infrastructure in Australia. So the specific project that I want to talk about along to illustrate that importance is it's a climate change vulnerability assessment of SEQ water built assets. So SEQ water is abbreviated for Southeast Queensland Water. So Southeast Queensland Water is the largest bulk water supplier of Queensland, and it has about $11 billion worth of built assets, including a number of dams, weirs, treatment plants, pumping stations, desalination plants, and most importantly, they have a grid of bulk supply water pipeline that connects different part of the region, so that allows them to transport water from different within the different part of the region. So they supply water for about over 3 million people living in this Southeast Queensland area. So it's really important to understand climate change vulnerability of their built assets. So and climate is changing in Southeast Queensland as other part of the world. And if we look at the climate change projections, it's very similar to the other part of the world. The temperatures will continue to increase in future all around, but most importantly, hotter and more frequent hot days will come, and there will be a number of harsher fire weather in future, and there is chances of reduction of rainfall, and more, however, when it will rain very heavily. Sea levels are projected to rise that will lead to more frequent extreme sea level events, and waters around the southeast Queensland are also projected to be warmer and more acidic. So this is where the SEQ water assets lie from Australia's geographic point of view. And so the purpose of this study was to help SEQ water move to their climate adaptation process. So we did this first. So if we think adaptation prioritization process as the reverse pyramid, the first step is to look at the vulnerability of all the assets across the whole organization. So that's what we did. We looked at each asset, each piece of pipeline, and tried to understand how vulnerable they are from the climate change point of view. And the next step would be, and that helped us to identify which assets are actually are at risk, so that in the next step, we can do a bit of detailed risk assessment to understand what's required to be done at an asset level. So this is a very broad first pass kind of vulnerability assessment that helped them to start the ball rolling. And although it is located in the coastal area, but we took a multi-hazard approach, because coastal area is not only about sea level rise and coastal inundation, it's also about bushfires and catchment flooding, temperature increase, and heat waves, and so on. So we looked at multiple types of hazards and how they can affect the built assets of SEQ water. And we looked at 3 time frames, 2030, 2050, and 2100, to align these findings with the asset management strategy of SEQ water. So if we think from asset management point of view, the climate change can impact assets in a different way. So there's of course physical damage, which can result from floods and all those types of extreme events. There's another interesting one is reduced useful life. Also, change in demand and maintenance regime can also happen. So the second one, the reduction in useful life, is really important from asset management point of view, because if at the beginning of life of every asset, we assign a value to it, and throughout its life, we depreciate that asset value, and towards the end of its life, there is a residual value that remains. So if climate change affects the assets, the remaining useful life of the asset can be reduced. And if that happens, then there's a reduction in the residual value. So that can lead to a big hole in the financial portfolio of asset managers. So it's really important to consider climate change impacts from an asset management point of view. And in terms of physical damage, so a number of assets of bulk water providers are concrete structures, so such as dams, weirs, and some of the pipelines as well. So it's important to understand for us how climate change can impact concrete structures. So the most important one is the carbonation. So what happens that I don't expect you to read everything, just wanted to highlight this point, that in calcium hydroxide within a concrete reacts with the carbon dioxide of the atmosphere, and that lowers the pH of the concrete. The process is called carbonation, and good concrete has a pH around 13, but if it goes below 8.3, then the protective cover of the concrete can get damaged, and the internal steel reinforcement can expose to corrosion. So this is not good for concrete structures. So the temperature increase can increase the carbonation rate, so that this type of corrosion can happen more often, and also availability of more carbon dioxide can also increase the carbonation process. So it's important for us to understand how this happens concrete structures. A lot of structures are also like pipes, big pipes that transfers water from one region to another, are made up of steel. So a study found that an increase of corrosion rate of about 14% for Brisbane within 1 kilometer of coastline under a high emission scenario at 2100. So corrosion is really a big challenge for maintaining steel structures, and that can increase, and that if that happens, then that will increase the maintenance cost of the asset. And also, if there's a reduction in rainfall, then the reduction of wash-off effect, that means that salt in the coastal area can stay longer on the surface of the steel structure, and they can increase the rate of corrosion. So in this way, we can actually start and conceptualize how different types of bulk water supply assets can be impacted by climate change. For example, a reduction in rainfall or increase in drought condition can cause compaction in soil, and that ultimately can cause additional stress to the underground concrete pipes or metal pipes, which was not considered in the design phase. So this can be problematic and increase the maintenance cost of the assets in the longer term. So it allowed us to understand actually all the different interdependencies of different types of hazards that can happen within the built infrastructure of assets. So once you understand that, we wanted to understand the vulnerability of each asset, as I mentioned. So vulnerability is a concept that is composed of mainly three main components. One is understanding how exposed that asset is to a given hazard. The second component is to understand how sensitive is the asset to that particular hazard. And the third component is what's the adaptive capacity of the system. So what's the capacity the asset has for to respond to some of those additional hazards. So the challenge is how can we operationalize this concept from asset management point of view? In order to do that, we developed an indicator-based system, which basically identified a bunch of indicators that helped us to understand exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Exposure is quite straightforward. If the asset is exposed to a hazard such as whether the asset is located in the flood-prone area or bushfire-prone area or so on, then the asset has a particular rating for exposure. In terms of sensitivity, we divided into two parts. One is structural sensitivity and the other one is user sensitivity. Structural sensitivity is basically understanding what's the age of the structure. Is it old? Is it what it's made up of? How it is used? Why it is, whether it is located underground or overground. So that will basically tell us how sensitive is that particular structure to a given hazard. And user sensitivity is we try to understand it by understanding to which extent well-being of the community or users of infrastructure is likely to be affected because of the disruption of service. Essentially, we try to understand what's the design capacity of the asset. So if the asset is designed to serve 200 households, that is probably a big piece of infrastructure in compared to an asset which is designed for only 10 houses, for example. So that once you understand exposure and sensitivity, that last part is the most challenging one to understand adaptive capacity. So it is really critical, and it is difficult to understand at an asset level to some extent because sometimes the type of information that is needed to understand the adaptive capacity of assets are not available readily for analysis. So we had to go through a number of asset management reports and asset existing risk management processes to understand how well the risks are managed in current day. From that, we could extrapolate that what can be the likely adaptive capacity in general for the organization. So then all these exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity are extracted for each piece of asset, starting from raw water pipeline, recycled pipeline, each pieces of 36 dams and weirs and so on. We looked at age, construction material, as I said. So the assumptions were underground pipes are generally less vulnerable as mostly they are pressurized, and overgrounds are sensitive to flood. If materials are not saline resistant, then sea level rise is an issue. So we had to look at the material, whether it's saline resistant or not. So that combining all this information, exposure sensitivity and capacity, helps us to find out the vulnerability of each asset, and then we could identify how many of the assets are actually at extreme vulnerable point, and how many of them are not so much vulnerable in current day or in future time frames. All this information are then converted to a dashboard, storyboard, which become a clickable map that the organization knows exactly which or where the assets are located, so that they click on the asset and specifically look into how climate change are likely to change in those areas, whether they're located in the flood-prone areas or not, whether they're located in the erosion-prone areas or not, what's the vulnerability ranking and so of that particular asset and so on. So that becomes a communication tool for the organization that they can then share within their stakeholders to have a better understanding of climate change risk of their assets. So that's in a nutshell the whole project that we went through, and the next step. So we, as I said, I've just presented the work that we did in this first portion of the triangle, which is vulnerability assessment. And using the outcome of this information, ST Water is now moving forward to their more detailed facility level risk assessment, where they will look at the facilities that we have identified as most vulnerable to understand more about more detailed climate change risk. And from there on, they can start thinking about, okay, what needs to be done in terms of managing those risks in future. So that's something that will happen in down the track in future. So that's all from my end. If you have any question, we will try to answer those in the question and answer session. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you. Thanks, Fahim. So can I get people to look in the Q&A? There are some questions emerging. We have one more presentation, but maybe the panelists can think about the questions that are in the Q&A so that we can move quite quickly to address those. So our final speaker is Professor Rodger Tomlinson, Emeritus Professor now, but he was the Foundation Director of the Griffith Centre for Coastal Management, and he's going to talk about managing coastal hazards on Gold Coast beaches. Over to you, Rodger. I cannot hear Rodger, can you?
My apologies, Jean. I will start again. This presentation is about the last 60 years of management of the beaches of the Gold Coast. Gold Coast City is the 6th largest city in Australia with a population over 600,000 people. It's been developed on a coastal floodplain, and there are all sorts of coastal hazard issues associated with our waterways and canal estates, but I'll just be focusing on the beaches. And the key feature of Gold Coast beaches is that development has occurred right up onto the foredune. And so it's a highly vulnerable set of assets that we are dealing with in terms of our beaches. The urbanized section of the Gold Coast beaches is about 30 kilometres long, and the Gold Coast City encompasses about 50 kilometres of the coastline. The city is at the southern extreme of the state of Queensland, and at that location, the hazards that we deal with are predominantly the tropical cyclones that referred to in previous talks being developed in the Coral Sea. Primarily, they impact in far north Queensland, but at various times, these cyclones can track down to the south and create very significant high wave conditions from the northeast. The other major feature is the extratropical cyclones that develop in the Tasman Sea between Australia and New Zealand, and they generate very long period swells over extended periods of time from the southeast to east. But overall, the average conditions result in a wave climate predominantly from the southeast. And the net result of that in terms of managing our beaches is that there is longshore sediment transport from the south to the north on average. That combined with the extreme erosion events that occur in particular storms are the two main things that we have to manage. The image on the lower right is actually from Sydney and demonstrates the impact of an East Coast low system, as we call them, on the beaches in metropolitan Sydney. But it also demonstrates what can happen if there hasn't been proactive management of beaches over in previous times. There's been a long history of extreme events on the Gold Coast, but particularly between the mid-1950s to the mid-1970s, we had a very extended period of storminess on the Gold Coast. And the highlight year was 1967, where there were 8 major extreme events occurred on the Gold Coast between January and June of that year. And the implication of that, of course, is that the beach systems had no chance of recovering naturally after each event, and erosion was very significant. At that time, the population of the Gold Coast was probably around about 50,000 people, with very low level of development of single dwellings, very low profile dwellings, but still there was very significant erosion along the Gold Coast, and it created a great deal of concern at the state government level. The state government, Queensland state government, commissioned a whole raft of studies, in particular with the Delft Hydraulics Laboratory in the Netherlands, which produced a milestone report in 1970, which set out a whole range of options for managing beaches on the Gold Coast. It also triggered the formation of a beach protection authority, which looked at the whole of the Gold Coast, whole of the Queensland coastline. That authority was in place for about 40 years and did a lot of excellent work in setting the framework for how we manage our coastlines. There was a Coastal Management Act passed in 1973 of direct relevance to the Gold Coast, setting out policy frameworks for the management of our beaches. As Jean referred to in her talk, of course, in Australia, the responsibility for doing things in our coastal zone falls within our local government, our municipalities. And the City of Gold Coast has been implementing the recommendations of the Delft report since the 1970s. It has been undertaking ongoing monitoring and research into coastal processes that impact on beach management. And as a result, it's developed a high reputation internationally for its innovation and application of world best practice, and particularly in terms of the development of innovative coastal protection strategies, and including artificial submerged reefs, which act as coastal control structures to reduce wave energy impacting on our beaches. And the photograph on the lower right there is of the recently constructed Palm Beach artificial reef. We've also had a very active and long-term program of nourishing our beaches from sources offshore and implementing major bypassing systems to ensure that that long-term average supply of sediment due to longshore transport from the south to the north is maintained. The key to this has been the acquisition of relevant data, and in particular, beach surveys, understanding the profile of the beach offshore out to around about 20 meters water depth, and the map on the far right demonstrates the kind of locations in which regular surveys are undertaken and have been undertaken since the early 1960s, building up a massive data set of the way in which the beach profile respond to storms and other impacts. More recently, camera technology has been used to take vertical images of the beach over a time period, and from that we can extract information about where the shoreline is at any given time. And that's very useful for the management of short-term variations in our coastline. There's a lot of work goes on in terms of on-the-ground monitoring of our dune systems and our beach system. The Queensland government has a network of wave rider buoys offshore, and there are 3 of those off the Gold Coast, which provide that fundamental data that we need on the wave conditions. And at various times, other measurements need to be taken, such of the coastal currents. All of that information feeds into the development of modelling systems for understanding and designing new structures or looking at the future. The image on the bottom left is a physical model that was developed for the Palm Beach Artificial Reef to assist in the design of that reef. And of course, there are many numerical modelling exercises being undertaken for design, but also for prediction of the future. And that's been a key feature of coastal management on the Gold Coast. But if you look at erosion management, the Gold Coast City Council operates on a system of, I guess, 2 overarching approaches to managing erosion. One is effectively a last line of defence, the construction of a seawall. And the lower image, you can see the exposed seawall after a major storm event, but the properties in very close proximity to that seawall are still standing. So the seawall has provided that, that mechanism. And the picture on the upper right is a much earlier time, just after the seawall is constructed, but it's still back then and continuing to provide that last line of defence for erosion. But coupled with that is to make sure that we have a usable beach. The Gold Coast is a tourism economy, and the beach is the main driver of that tourism. Without a wide sandy beach, there's far less attraction for tourists. So the strategy is to make sure that we don't see images like the one, this major image on the bottom of an exposed seawall, but that it is covered up with a major nourishment of supply of sand primarily from offshore regions to ensure that the amenity of the beach is maintained. Looking at the seawall, which is termed the A-line seawall in the Gold Coast, it's approximately 30 kilometres long, and about 50% of that is to a design that was stipulated back in the 1960s and 70s for the construction of that wall. And that design is gazetted, and any new wall has to be constructed to that particular design. Like Mackay, there are sections of the beach which are in private ownership, and the private owners are responsible for the seawall in front of their property, and the rest of the coast is handled by the City Council. Of course, at various times, local residents get concerned about an erosion event and will implement unapproved attempts to protect their properties, as shown on the 2 photos on the right. Under those circumstances, they're required to remove those and construct a certified seawall. Beach nourishment has been undertaken on the Gold Coast for many decades, and to date, over about 25 million cubic metres of sand has been placed on our beaches, primarily from sources offshore. That tends to mean the use of large ocean-going dredges, similar to the 2 images shown here. When a decision is made to get that sand right onto the beach as close as possible, the usual technique is to rainbow that, shown on the bottom photograph, to get it as close to the beach front as possible. But the Gold Coast has pioneered the process of implementing what we term nearshore nourishment, where the sand is placed usually through bottom dumping dredges similar to the one on the top photos in slightly deeper water, mimicking where a storm bar would be created under storm conditions, and then allowing the natural processes under calm conditions of recovery of that beach sand onto the beach. There are two other areas that are implemented in the city's planning scheme that affect beach coastal erosion management. One is that any new beachfront development must have a seawall constructed to the certified standard. And that includes any redevelopment of existing property. The other one is that when excavation is underway for the foundations of new buildings, particularly high-rise buildings, that sand must be cleaned and placed on the beach to be returned to the natural system. Just touching bases on the major bits of beach management infrastructure on the Gold Coast, we have two sand bypassing systems. These are jetties that extend out across the storm bar. They consist of jet pumps buried well below the seabed. Sand is fluidized, brought to the surface, and then pumped across onto downdrift beaches. In the case of the image on the left, which is the Gold Coast Seaway, on the northern part of the Gold Coast, the sand is pumped across to South Stradbroke Island to ensure that that supply of sand that would normally move its way along further to the north is maintained. The photograph on the far right is of the Tweed River system, which is at the southern end of the Gold Coast, and their sand is pumped across the Tweed River to maintain the supply of sand onto the Gold Coast beaches. So these are very significant bits of infrastructure. The one at the north was constructed in 1985 and the one to the south in 2000. So just in summary, we have sand bypassing systems. We also have groin systems such as Kira Point. We have two creeks within our Gold Coast region that have been trained and managed in terms of dredging of the entrances. We have ongoing beach nourishment right along the full stretch of the coast recently for the Commonwealth Games. We have these artificial reefs such as Narraneck and the recent one at Palm Beach. And at the top end of the coast, or the urbanised section of the Gold Coast, we have the major entrance of the Gold Coast Seaway and the sand bypassing system that was constructed there. These systems have been in place now progressively over the last 60 years, as I've said. The City of Gold Coast is currently developing a coastal hazard adaptation strategy as part of the Q-Coast 2100 program to look at how effective these kinds of systems are going to be moving forward under the impact of climate change. Designs that have been developed over the years, there's a general view that our beach management will be fine for the next 50 years or so. Beyond that, with a worst case scenario for climate change, I guess we really need to be very conscious that we need to continue to monitor. We need to continue to look for alternative solutions and to get better education of our community in terms of the impact of climate change. And that, of course, is quite problematic on the Gold Coast because it is a tourism-oriented community, and a lot of the folk that utilise our beaches are from elsewhere and may not really appreciate the significance of both the work that has been done in the past and the challenges we face in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Rodger. Okay, so I hope everybody's had the opportunity to look at the Q&A, and there are now quite a few questions. I thought I'd start with a couple of the very specific ones. So in the middle there, there's one for Fahim on concrete, which I thought we could have a look at. And then there's one about Cairns and Mackay, which I've now lost. but I thought that that could be answered by, so I think that's the one that is, I'm thinking, which is, have you, so from Ashim Saha, have you conducted physical and hazard mapping to measure the climate vulnerability assessment? So I thought maybe we could look at that for Cairns and Mackay very briefly. So Fahim, can you have a look at this question from Will Howard about carbonation problem in the cement industry, if you feel you have any expertise to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So the carbonation problem is actually nothing new to engineers. It has been there for many times in the past. But the main issue is increasing of carbonation rate as temperature increases, and the problem to fix that is not very difficult if the carbonation haven't started yet. So there's different types of coatings available that can be added on top of concrete that allows that reduction of carbonation rate. But if the carbonation has already started and rebars are already exposed because of carbonation problem, then it becomes problematic. It's not straightforward to fix that. And in terms of wondering how construction and cement industry is anticipating this problem, as I said, yes, it's nothing new. And there has been a lot of research going on in terms of developing new types of materials, new types of coatings to increase lifespan of some of these assets going forward. Recently, we are doing work with IPWEA, which is Institute of Public Works Engineers Australasia, where we are working with some material experts from University of Sydney and ATS to develop a guideline which answers some of these specific questions. That, okay, how can we make some of the concrete structures more resilient considering future climate? How can we make some of the roads more resilient, bituminous roads more resilient on the future climate? So there are actually work going on this space.
Thanks, Fahim. So there is this question from Ashim Saha about physical and hazard mapping to measure climate vulnerability assessment. I don't know, David, whether you would like to say something about that with respect to Cairns?
Yeah, sure. That's exactly what we've already done as SIM. Is as part of the process, we've already mapped our 3 hazards, and we've mapped all of the other information on the physical environment as well. And so that's how we've been able to get an understanding of where the hazards are likely to occur. So that we would say is a component towards the vulnerability assessment. And I guess what we've done then is to use that vulnerability data and just understanding what assets are in total are affected by a particular hazard. And then we start to look at what that matters. So what are the consequences? And when we're looking at those consequences, we've considered a range of different consequences. So we've considered a range of social consequences. What does that matter to the community in many ways? And we've considered economic consequences. So both the economic aspects to the council itself, but also to the asset owners, whether they're at a state level or community level or an individual level. And then we've also looked at the consequences to the environment. And then we report in our risk report for Cairns, we report on each of those different risks associated with those 3 different categories. And so that when we start to look at where we prioritize the actions, we can understand what the consequence was, and therefore that helps us to identify what the adaptation measures are and to prioritize them.
So David, is any of that work published? Because I see Will Howard is asking for a reading list related to this session. So would there be anything we could add?
A lot of these we can certainly give some websites addresses where people can go on and get some of the mapping. the actual reports themselves for the projects are still ongoing, and some of them will become publicly available through council at some stage in the next 6 months. So these final reports for all of that work are due in about June this year, and then they will become available on in a sort of, I guess, grey literature type of reporting. I'm really hoping that we'll be able to then translate some of what we've learned in these to the more published literature as well down the track.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Robyn, would you like to say anything about this question?
Yeah, we've gone through the similar process with mapping the hazards, and then looking at the risk, looking at the demographics. Ours are more on the physical risk. So we've looked at the impact of above floor flooding. So like we have the typical Queenslanders that are resilient to a lot of the flooding, but when it's flooded above the floor level, there's a greater level of damage. So we've gone into the tolerable or intolerable sort of risks based on that hazard mapping. And then the vulnerabilities is where we're focusing on more the vulnerable facilities like aged care or hospitals or disability services. So from an emergency management perspective, yeah, so we haven't, those studies aren't documented yet publicly, but in the future, the hazards are all out there, but the risks and how they're being managed aren't publicly available yet.
Thanks, Robyn. So, Rodger, do you want to add anything for the Gold Coast about this? I don't know what is or is not available.
Certainly, this issue is being addressed with the development of the Coastal Hazard Adaptation Strategy, and I think Fahim is actually working on that, particularly on behalf of the City Council at present. And the real focus there is on, the more on the inland waterways, the Gold Coast Broadwater, the Canal Estates, that kind of thing, because I guess they're seen as the really big picture in terms of coastal hazard on the Gold Coast.
Thank you. So there's a couple of questions at the top about risk. So maybe we could handle those together. And we've probably all got something that we'd like to say about this. So there's one from Will Howard about compound extreme events and whether those are handled well by current methods of risk assessment, and are there other ways to do it? There's also a question about risk screening. Can you tell me something about risk screening in Australia? Sarah, on the basis of your knowledge of Coast Adapt, is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, sure.
Speakers. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Look, I think certainly we have encouraged in Coast Adapt people to think about compound risks. I think it's quite difficult for people to it's difficult enough to think about risks on their own when you bring them together into compound risks, but they're the ones that I think tend to be some of the most important ones, because they tend to be the ones that go outside of a lot of what we traditionally think about in terms when we're thinking about emergency management or existing risks. So I think they're important ones to emphasise and to get our heads around and grapple with. Yeah, that's probably what I'd say about compound risks.
Fahim, you did a lot on risk assessment in Coast Adapt. So what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really important point that this sort of concurrent risks are accommodated in the risk assessment. Now, the question is whether the framework allows us to do that or not. So that I would say yes, because framework, the way I can talk from the Coast Adapt risk assessment framework. The way we have designed, we have 3 levels of risk assessment: first pass, second pass, and third pass. So, and that the idea is, more you go down to the deeper level, you start considering some of those advanced type of hazards and advanced type of some of these concurrent hazards into account. So for probably in the fast pass risk assessment, you probably won't consider those concurrent events. But when you are doing a second pass or maybe a third pass when you're specifically looking at a facility or asset or particular area, that what are the risk of storm tide, for example, to this particular facility. Then you start thinking about, you can consider actually some of those concurrent events. So the framework allows you to do it, but whether you have sufficient information to channel into your assessment process, that's another question.
Dave?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with him. This is something that actually keeps me up at night, because we often do the work that we are asked to do by clients or by government or whoever. And in the case of, say, something like the coastal hazard adaptation strategies that we're talking about, we've been focused on 3 hazards: so sea level rise, storm surge, and erosion. And storm surge, yes, we include sea level rise in the modelling, so we were able to address that there. But what we haven't done is take the rainfall and associated flooding into account in any of our hazard modelling. And we've not been able to do it because the guidance given to us by our government has not allowed us to do that. We've all recommended to the councils to do that sort of work. Now, Cairns, as most of you saw, has got a very wet footprint in a number of years' time, and that was without rain. And it's in a cyclone area. It is going to get flooded. Flooding already causes big challenges in Cairns. It's something that they have to do, and they're aware of it. But it has impacted, and the reason it gives me sleepless nights is because we're doing so much work with communities to tell them about the resilience that we're building into their community from these 3 hazards that we're addressing. And it might give them false feelings that they're actually, if they do those, they'll be resilient to some of the factors of climate change that haven't been taken into account in the risk assessments. So yeah, it's a very, very strong recommendation of ours in the work that we've done, is that they need to do the modelling to address coincidence. We're very well served by brilliant models available in Australia from a range of different sources to be able to do this and to be able to do it effectively. It just needs the investment.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things about adaptation that make it quite difficult to pick it apart and think in terms of risk if you use standard risk assessment approaches. And yet local governments, for example, they really want us to use the international standard approaches to risk assessment. But really, when you think about adaptation, issues around the timescales that you're dealing with, which are many decades, and issues like compound events make it quite difficult to use standard approaches, but that's what we have. But I think things like adaptation pathways open up some new channels of thinking around risk and adaptation. Robyn, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, we've considered, because we have the big Pioneer River and storm tide, and when we get a cyclone, one day it's storm tide and high winds, the following day it's riverine flooding or local flooding. So we do consider the risk types, and it was factored in when we did our CHAS submission. However, we've had to self-fund a lot of our work to look at more multi-hazards and to look at resilience, creating resilience in the community. You want to create it holistically, whether it be erosion, bushfire, flooding, and a lot of them are complementary to creating better, like improved community cohesiveness and listening to what the community values. So I think it is moving towards multi-hazard in the future. So,
Rodger?
Yeah, I mean, totally support everything that's said. I mean, I think the thing here is that to develop an overarching framework is a little bit problematic because of, coincident riverine flooding and coastal issues are such a site-specific problem. Here on the Gold Coast, we have very short catchments. Cyclone brings the rain, the catchment will flood virtually instantly. And so the risk of coincidence is high. You get other situations where there might be a delay. Every site is different, but it really needs to be done. And as Dave pointed out, it's not part of the current processes within Queensland as part of the Coastal Hazard Adaptation Strategy. And unfortunately, a lot of the community will relate more to the riverine side of the flooding than they will to the coastal side of it, and will think one is the same as the other. And it doesn't really help, as Robyn pointed out, with with communicating with the community about some of these issues. And but it really needs to be tackled into the future.
Yeah, I think that we probably need a little bit more data as well. We need a better understanding of how likely these coincident events are to occur, which is it's tractable, but it's complex, and there are statistical models that allow you to do an evaluation of the likelihood of concurrent events. But it's not straightforward, and not many people have tried to tackle it. But maybe we need a bigger literature on how likely and these events are likely to be, and how severe they are likely to be. I think both are necessary. We haven't said anything about risk screening. Does anybody want to say anything about risk screening in the few moments that remain to us, or do we have nothing to say about that? There is a question about hazard and exposure, which it's probably just we can answer. So my understanding is that, so please distinguish hazard and exposure. Well, hazard to me is the thing, the cyclone, the storm, the heat wave, the drought. And the exposure is, are you in the firing line? Is it going to affect you? So for example, a hazard would be a tropical cyclone. Exposure to a tropical cyclone in Melbourne would be very low because it's too far south. It's too far away from the equator, whereas the exposure of Cairns to a tropical cyclone is high because of its latitude and location. Which brings me in passing then to the very final thing that I would like to ask Dave about, which is the hospital in Cairns. So Dave, is there no contingency planning for the replacement or the movement of the Cairns Hospital? Just, you have a minute to answer that before the end.
So they've built a very small facility well above for Cairns levels, about 6 meters above sea level rise, about 3 kilometers inland, that can look after about 100 patients. But Cairns Hospital looks after a lot more. So what they basically do is, when they know there's a category 4 or above cyclone approaching, they basically relocate all the patients. So that means the airport has to function, and they have to be able to get the patients to the airport. But they then they actually put them on airplanes and fly them to Brisbane because Townsville's too close. So
it is quite a good example of maladaptation, isn't it?
It's horrendous. Yeah. And they have $100 million of equipment on below the ground floor, and that's all the radiography rooms and a whole lot of stuff. They get their supply chains from the port, which is right the other side of the city, which is the other area that's almost blue right now. So they have got some challenges. They realize that, and they are working towards it, but they are in a mess, because to get the sort of investment required to move is incredibly expensive. And so invest seems to be what they do.
Thanks, Dave. So we've heard some examples of good adaptation, and finally we've heard an example of where things are maybe going a little bit wrong, and it's difficult to see a way out of the problem, but no doubt in the end one will emerge, because eventually we do have to find ways out. I'd like to thank everybody for taking part in this session this afternoon. It's been fascinating for me individually to catch up with what's happening around the Queensland coastline around adaptation, and I'm really pleased to learn that there is a lot of activity, and that the state government is really stepping up to underpin the activities of the local councils, and the local councils are doing some truly excellent and world-class work in coastal adaptation. So thank you to everybody for taking part. Thank you for contributing to the discussion, and thank you to all the speakers. And I will now close this session. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Goodbye.
Happy is reporting the close script.